rendering. Oh, where's Steve Conley? Oh, there you go.
There he is.
We had some system malfunction. Sorry about that, you guys. Guys, it must be Wednesday again. Where does the time go? Kind of like in our old age, you guys. You know, you only tell the passing of the days because you have to take the trash out once again.
Right. And you always rush no matter what. You're always rushing for trash. You hear that truck.
We're officially changing the live cast to Racing for Trash on Wednesdays at 8 p.m.
Trash milk.
Trash milk. Oh, it's my favorite thing. Well, hello. And welcome back to Pencil to Pencil, your favorite, not podcast, live cast, coming to you, LIVE, live, Wednesdays at 8 p.m. EST. This is the only, I'll just go out on a limb and say this is the only live running podcast-ish thing that is run by expert cartoonists, right? There's a lot of people out here doing this stuff, right? But not all of them can say they're expert cartoonists who all come together to interview other expert cartoonists. And as we call fly on the wall live casting, if you were or are a cartoonist in good standing or somebody who's interested in the business, where else are you going to get this kind of talk? Not your barbershop, not the pool hall. No, you got to come to.
Yeah, I haven't been to the barbershop in a while.
Hey, don't even ask me about the barbershop. I've been inside a barbershop in 20 years. But
just lean your head into the pencil sharpener and just let it pull off a dread or two, and you're all set, right?
Now there was a point in time where I used to go to the barbershop and I would get the edge up. Like I had like the Boston Fern dreads on top, and then I would get
something down over your head, and whatever poked through got snipped.
Like the Coolio, is that what they say on the wall? But that was a long time ago. Let me do the introductions. Hello, guys. My name is JAMAR NICHOLAS. I'm an author, illustrator, and cartoonist. I have a series at Scholastic on the graphics imprint. Leon the Extraordinary is in stores now. Go cop it. And guess what, you guys? The book 2 just dropped on Amazon, Target, and all those places. No cover image yet, but the title's been revealed. Leon,
Jamar, come on.
Hey, I had nothing to do with it. Leon, Worst Friends Forever, the second volume in the Leon series, will be in stores May 7th, 2024. Pre-order now. Thank you. I would be remiss if I did not introduce one of our lovely co-hosts. He is do the belt motion, the world heavyweight champion of web comics. His name is Stone Cold Steve Conley. Tell him what's up, Steve Conley.
Hello, gentlemen. In that title, I'm telling you, Scott Kurtz is going to come leaping off the top turnbuckle and smack me with an aluminum chair.
I'd love to see that. Hey, how are you?
It's so good to see you.
You too.
I think I would be remiss. Well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
Hold on. What do you do, Steve?
I write and draw the webcomic The Middle Age, which you can read at middleagecomic.com. It's on Webtoons and Tapas and Go Comics and my own website. And I also do TTRPG content like Intoximancy and Death Dealing and a soon-to-be-announced third volume. And yeah, so that's who I am. But I would be remiss. I did not introduce the Tower Power, the Man of the Hour, too sweet to be sour. In Rice Krispie terms, the Kirby Crackle to our Snap and Pop, Mr. Mike Manley.
Holy crap. Hello, Mike Manley. Mike Manley, what do you do, dear sir?
I draw Judge Parker and the original superhero, the Phantom.
Wait, you mean the purple dude with the straight shorts?
The 88-year-old purple grandpa still running around in the jungle.
Wow, the OG of superheroes.
The OG. He had the cave before the Batman.
That's fantastic.
Those vertical stripes on the shorts, very slimming.
Yes. You know, I've been trying them myself.
That's what. Now, Mike, I like to ask questions of you a lot, and a lot of people are kind of surprised to hear that there are still people doing comic strips as a tried and true profession. But how do you juggle 2 strips at the same time?
You see where I'm sitting?
Yes.
That's crazy. Also, I wanted to show, last week I think I previewed.
Oh, hold on.
I just sent it to you. This is the finished version of the commission that I just did.
Wow, look at that. That's
Ghost
fantastic.
Rider and Batman Azrael.
Asbats. Wow.
That's
fantastic. How big is that?
That's 14 by 17.
Cheese and crackers. Wow, that's beautiful.
I think I was originally commissioned to do like 11 by 17, but then I had the 14 by 17, and I'm like, well, I got these two guys and the motorcycle.
Yeah.
And then I decided to put them in the graveyard. And originally I was going to have them in the city, but then I was like, I don't want to rule all these.
Right.
Right.
You say you're going to add a little splatter. I think I see some.
Yeah. And then that ended up being an issue because, boy, that's a technical thing today. You can take it off the screen there, guys.
Yes, sir.
I bought this masking fluid.
Oh wow, you're old school.
Right.
Hold on, let me put.
Oh, you got to use masking fluid. So I bought this masking fluid, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of them.
Mm-hmm.
Before, when I used to, back in the day, I would use rubber cement. But rubber cement, as it turns out over years, even if you take it all off, still stains the paper.
Mm-hmm.
So I bought this watercolor masking fluid. But the problem is that the paper today is not great. So I was using, 3-ply, cold press, you have a little texture, Strathmore. And then I drew everything, and then I was going to said, I'll put some splatter on. And so I covered the areas with the masking fluid. But then when I started to pull it up, some of the surface of the paper wanted to peel off. In the old days, that never happened with Strathmore. Never. But the rag content of paper today is not nearly as good as it was, which really means that the cotton fiber gets mixed in with the pulp, which gives the paper its
tooth.
Yeah, its tooth and its surface and its strength. Well, modern paper is nowhere near as good. And you talk to any cartoonist, everybody bitches about the paper. Mm-hmm. So it started. So I had to be very careful, and there were little air patches where it wanted to pull up, just like the top fluff of the paper. So I don't know whether I might have to go back to the old way of masking, which would be you would literally cut a frisket and stick it down, do your toothbrush thing.
I love it.
I don't want to draw something and like, peel the guy's face off or something.
And also the tried and true mistakes from a cartoonist drafting table. Paint or ink water and coffee cup, or it's way too close together.
Actually, that happened years ago, but now my coffee cup is higher and my ink is lower.
Oh, there you go. I have the higher ground.
Right, right.
And also toothbrush for teeth or toothbrush for spatter.
Well, if you saw that toothbrush after I spattered, you would not put that thing in your mouth.
That's important.
Maybe it would brighten your teeth, like that black stuff you see people advertise on Twitter. It's like, make your teeth brighter, and it looks like some, carbonized goo or something.
Well, guys, if you are new to the live cast, we got a like for that. When you say carbonized goo, we got a thumb for it. If you're new to the live cast, what happens here is Mike, Steve, and myself, we go live every Wednesday, 8 p.m., and we talk about the business of cartooning, illustration, comics, everything in between. And then sometimes we have guests. We're really proud to bring in other kind of stalwarts of the industry from all corners of it. And tonight we have a fantastic comic book artist and illustrator and writer and self-publisher, ZANDER CANNON. I've been a fan of Xander for a long time. I think this is like the Graybeard channel tonight because everybody's repping their grays. And Steve and Mike and I were talking about just like the essence of a lot of our starts in the business. And Mike's been around a little bit longer than us, but even with Steve, myself, and Xander, the road's getting kind of long too for us. But we're talking about maybe the late 90s, mid 90s, something like that for some of us. But Xander has a very storied history in comics. One of my favorite things of all time was Replacement God. That came out a little while ago, and I'll try to make Xander blush when we get him on screen. We'll talk more about that. And KAIJUMAX, which is a fantastic series through Oni, that he's going to talk about, and a lot of stuff in between. So before he eats all the M&Ms out of the green room, let's bring him in to Pencil. Let me get my stuff together here. Welcome to Pencil, Zander Cannon. Oh, there you are. I messed it up. Oh, man, I'm off.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Act like you just showed up.
Oh,
there you go. Hey, welcome, man. Hope that wasn't too long for you.
No, it was great. I mean, I was just eating M&Ms in the green room.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Welcome to the channel. It was really exciting. We've been like talking loosely for a couple of years, you and I.
Yeah.
And at some point, I was just like, we got to get him on the show.
Yeah.
And also, I found out that you and Steve go way back. Like just
our
met,
paths
like
crossed at San Diego every year back in like mid '90s, and
And SPX too, right?
Yeah, and SPX, yeah, that's right. Because I was doing stuff with slave labor graphics, so I was in the Bay Area doing stuff.
And here we are now. So maybe we'll just start. We haven't done this in a while, Xander. With a lot of our guests, we ask for what we call your origin story.
Okay.
So, without getting too deep into the weeds, just maybe kind of tell us, like, where did your path for wanting to be a cartoonist start, and how did you kind of get your foot in the door?
Well, when I was like in high school, maybe ninth grade or something like that, I met Burke Breathitt, the artist who did Bloom County. He I don't know where he was living at the time, but there was a big auction of his artwork at the Denver, like the sort of governor's mansion in Denver. And so, all that stuff was too rich for my family's blood, but but I got to meet him, and I was this, young cartoonist who really wanted to make something. And, he said, and he was just saying, get published any way you can. Just, he had talking about, he had done a college comic strip, and that was the thing that sort of let him cut his teeth and kind of get all of his bad habits out of the way so that he could kind of hit the ground running when Bloom County came out. And I don't know if that was his first one published, but anyway. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking that, and I made mini comics. So, I mean, I wasn't being published, excuse me, but I was leaving it behind, like I didn't have to show it to somebody. I could just give them my mini comic or sell them my mini comic, which was satisfying too. And then when I was in college, I started doing comic strips, but that was the early 90s when I was in college, and it's like it was sort of accepted best practice to sort of like headhunt for like the young hot shots, because Image had just sort of broken off, and like because Jim Lee was so young and Rob Liefeld was so young, and all those guys were like these young hotshots were breaking all the rules. And so New England Comics Press sort of found me after I'd done a bunch of comic strips for the school paper, and I did Chainsaw Vigilante, which was a middling satire on superheroes. And it didn't go for very long. It only went for 3 issues, and all sorts of threads were left dangling. And but as like when you have 3 published comics in your hands, you can hand those to people and kind of say, I can do this. I'm legit. And after that, it's like I went to Slave Labor Graphics. I did the Replacement God, and I mean, all along this time, I'd sort of tried to send my stuff into like Marvel and DC and all these places where I could be a penciler or an inker, but it just I think I should have learned this lesson a little bit more, certainly when I was young, which is like I don't really have the type of skills that people want to just plug into a thing. Like I'm not the guy who's going to draw Green Lantern the way that it's supposed to be drawn, or I'm not going to be the guy who everything I do is a little bit idiosyncratic, and so yeah, so I did this creator-owned book called The Replacement God, and then and then Gene Ha kind of found me and put me in, like brought me along when he was doing Top 10. And so what was happening there was that we experimented a little bit, but I ended up doing a lot of layouts. And I found that was the way that I actually enjoyed interacting with a big company like that, because my layouts are very conventional superhero adventure type of stuff. And so that was sort of nice for me, even though it was, when people said, "Oh, I love Top 10," and I'm like, you don't really like what I bring to Top 10, other than the fact that it comes out regularly. You like Gene Ha, and as you should, and you like Alan Moore, as you should. But and thank you very much. That's what I would always say. So anyway, and then, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how long you want me to give me this origin, because that kind of brings us up to about the mid 2000s. But
yeah. Well, we could slow the bus down a little bit, and maybe go back to Chainsaw Vigilante, just from kind of like your beginnings. And I know that there's a lot of cartoonist origin stories started with the college strip. There's so I was even thinking about you, Maryland, like where a bunch of people came out of there, like Cho came out of there, and Aaron McGruder came out of there, and I think that's kind of like an unsung part of comics history, is young cartoonists figuring things out on the college page. Maybe talk a little bit about this. How, did you start doing a strip from like your freshman year, or did you experiment a little bit, or just start late? Talk about that for a minute.
I started in my sophomore year, because my freshman year I was trying I was doing a lot of theater design and stuff like that, and then the sort of the second year I'd kind of gotten my act together in terms of the pens and the paper and what I wanted to do, and I really very consciously made it into like a portfolio, a portfolio from the get-go. So it's like everything was going to be like, oh, here's a parody of this like action adventure thing, but it's going to be a gag strip as well. And then here's a parody of, a ghost story, and here's a parody of, and so it was kind of trying to show range. I mean, it was trying to exercise my range as well. And so, yeah, I was it was a little bit transparent in retrospect, but yeah, and it was great, because it was, not only is it a place to sort of show it off to everybody out there, but also it's like, oh, this didn't reproduce very well, or this did reproduce really well, and obviously printing changes so fast even then, but it was nice to kind of go like, oh yeah, I way over rendered that didn't do very well on newsprint.
And I know a little bit about that, because I had my own dalliance with that. And I also remember that was a really early time of being under the thumb of an editor. Probably like a frat-faced bro who's running the newspaper, is like, dude, it's got to be in Monday at 7. That's it. And we're running across campus to the basement to get this thing in.
Yeah. I certainly remember. I was excited about this to the detriment of everything else I did. And so I didn't turn them in early or anything, but I never had to run. I remember that. And it's like, that was probably the last time in my life that I was actually like early enough that I didn't have to run to the play. So I should have enjoyed it while I could. But and it was nice too, because and then there were artists that were like a couple years behind me that were like, oh, he's doing it. And so for a while we even had like a comics page where we had, everybody, there were maybe three strips running at the same time, which was pretty cool. Editorialized, they left me alone, because I just they're like, we don't understand what you're doing. It's complete nonsense. And I'm like, yeah, that's right.
And that hole was filled in the paper, so
yeah.
That's right. And I did sort of, and that was another thing where it's like, this isn't going to be perfect. You're going to have to flub, you're going to have to kind of like, just kind of crank out that last panel that you just kind of can't get right. Maybe you just make it a silhouette or something, because that hole's got to get filled.
And go ahead, Mike.
We running in time.
Like, who or what were you looking at to sort of like learn the technical, the ropes. Like, who are you looking at? Like, if you're drawing, you want to draw for Marvel, then you sort of have, how to draw comics to Marvel. You sort of have a known flight path.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you're doing something in the college paper, and you said you're looking at, I would take it you're looking at comic strips more than comic books at that point.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Walt Kelly, maybe, and I mean, I remember rereading and rereading an old Pogo book, but I had some. I mean, Will Eisner stuff. I mean, it sounds like, oh yes, I was reading the classics. But I mean, I really, for whatever reason, I was really obsessed with Will Eisner at that time. Just like, not even the spirit stuff, but just like even his books on sequential storytelling and stuff. I just thought that his examples were really good, and like, and he was doing stuff where you could, the brushy rain effect, and I don't know. I was reading comics like mad, like I was catching up on all the comics. And I was going to All in a Dream in Iowa City, and Paul Tobin actually worked there at the time. So that was, so we were kind of meeting at the very beginnings of both of our careers, and and he was always hooking me up with great stuff. And,
cool.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to sort of go from the people that I really idolized to the people that I actually was similar to. I always loved John Byrne, and I always loved Alan Davis and stuff like that. And I didn't feel like I was really like those guys, except, maybe Alan Davis's idiosyncrasies or whatever. But it was interesting to sort of move into the ones that I really was like.
Yeah. Because I think that's a very sort of an interesting time, especially I think it's harder for younger people to realize that it was more of like a treasure hunt in a way, and there weren't as many resources for learning the craft aspect of it.
Right.
Like now, you could not exhaust just YouTube of all the stuff, but
1,000 different established styles and sort of and lanes that you can go into, and
so I mean, like, just deciding whether you want to struggle to learn how to use a brush or do you want to learn how to use a pen. That's a big thing for some cartoonists.
And I remember using a pen and getting to the point where I was like, I'm really using this more like a brush. And so then when I switched to a brush, I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Smoother lines, and
In college, were you writing and drawing your own stories as well? You were writing them as well?
Yeah. I was writing. I mean, I didn't really know anybody else who was doing it at that time. And I was, that was my obsession. I just wanted, I would spend 10, 15 hours on each of these strips. I mean, it was crazy.
And then you're also lettering, which is another curve for some people.
Yeah. I mean, that was a crazy thing to jump into a strip where you have to know how to write pencil ink letter. That's wild. I mean, you can't, because I mean, it just means that, and of course, it really is just a matter of spending the time to try to make it nice. But yeah, it's a deep end for sure.
And with I'm assuming you were doing like a weekly strip.
Yeah.
How many days were you spending on a strip, or did you knock it out in a night? Like, what was your schedule like for those?
Well, it's hard to remember now, but I mean, it was probably, like I would have a bunch of ideas, and then I would probably do it in a day, like maybe start it one day and then do the bulk of it the next day or something. But
go ahead. I'm sorry, Xander.
No, that's it.
The reason I'm so kind of stuck on these points is that I'm super interested in kind of like the beginning of people's acceleration. You know what I mean? Like, we're all standing here swapping war stories, but I think there's really something interesting about getting up the courage to go into boot camp and say, I'm going to be a soldier.
I agree.
You know what I mean?
And it's interesting to sort of go like, well, what were you trying to like counter program? Like I remember when I was first getting into comics, like the Image, well, all the guys who had created Image, they'd sort of had this run of doing like these big tough guys, and all in sort of the wake of the Dark Knight Returns. And like, there was this sort of like this sense that all of the superhero and action adventure stuff was so gritty and mean. And I wanted to do something that was you know, sort of sillier or like more of a throwback, or and I think that that's kind of an interesting, like, so when I did the Replacement God, that was very consciously in my mind. I wanted to do sort of a happy-go-lucky character, you know, and things that were maybe that was a little bit more optimistic than, you know, you know. And I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, because sometimes people are like, oh yeah, I saw that it was dark and gritty, I want to do dark and gritty, and I just didn't feel comfortable doing that. So I think that's always interesting. Like, what was the world like when you started?
Yeah.
And I love that it pushed against that grain a bit. Like everyone's going in one, you know, there's kind of a commercial path that was more obvious back then. Let's, you know, go with the flow. But you did something very different that was, and kind of leaning into your hopefully cartooniness is. Hopefully, I don't take that the wrong.
No, I love it. It's a badge of honor.
Yeah, that's why I always loved your work, is that it has so much life to it, and Replacement God in particular just jumped out as being this very different thing. The genre, the style, it really meshed well together. It was nice to see something that felt harmonious, that didn't feel like fitting something into a container that wouldn't hold it.
Yeah, it was a little out of fashion. I think even fantasy was not having a moment at the time. No. I don't think. You know, I mean, there were a few, like Thieves and Kings was coming out, and of course Bone was coming out. But yeah, like, I mean, Lord of the Rings hadn't sort of had its, you know, renaissance yet, and so it was interesting to sort of do that, and you know, and all this, and of course you didn't have the internet, so I was just looking up stuff at my college library of like where it was like a 13th century clothing looking like, and so a lot of it is sort of from very sort of like staid like academic sources, and not from, you know, whatever,
well,
Lord of the Rings or Monster Manual or whatever. But
it was interesting too, because the couple of artists that you mentioned, specifically Will Eisner, I mean, he did noir, but he was in even his heaviest moments, there's a sense of cartooniness and animation to it. You mentioned, you know, Walt Kelly, obviously an incredibly talented, playful cartoonist. And so you're mentioning artists that would consider themselves would call themselves cartoonists. This is something I've been sort of going on a little bit on my Facebook page. It's like, do you call yourself a cartoonist? Do you consider yourself a cartoonist? And is being a cartoonist considered to be sort of a, well, you know, you're a cartoonist. It's not, you know, it's not gritty. You know, you don't have veins on your teeth. You know,
right.
And it's sort of interesting because I think it's sort of generational. The old guys called themselves cartoonists. All the old guys called themselves cartoonists. I
remember Frank Miller saying something about calling himself a cartoonist and then calling Steve Ditko a cartoonist, and I was like, I guess I wouldn't have thought of that as the first word that would come to mind for either of those guys. But it's, I mean, obviously it's true, and I definitely think of myself as a cartoonist. I mean, you know, I think that it's all kind of a matter of like who's asking and why. You know, like if people ask me at a cocktail party what I am, I say I'm a cartoonist, but I'm like, I'm a comic book artist, because that kind of gives you a sense of what I do all day. You know, even though also a writer. You know, like, you just want people to have the right image in mind, I suppose.
Well, I do think that there was a time, probably starting in the 80s, and then really after the Image guys, because of the whole trajectory of, you know, Watchmen and Dark Knight and everything, that cartoony, or if you said I was a cartoonist, well, that meant Charles Schulz. That meant something that was silly or lighter, not something with veins in its teeth, you know, not something like, you know,
gross,
you know, Puff, right?
And right.
That even the fans everybody sort of went to becoming a comic book artist and not a cartoonist to distinguish the flavor of things.
Well, and they've taken it farther too. I mean, you know, like there's people who are comic book artists, but then there's also people who are graphic novelists. And I've sort of talked to people who are more academic about it, and they're like, "Oh, are you a cartoonist or a comic book artist or a graphic novelist?" And I'm like, "Give me a break! Like, it's just a long comic book, you know." And obviously, a collection of Aquaman isn't really a graphic novel, but like everything's kind of I don't know.
Right.
Well, I think
it's funny that people try to make the distinction based on quality, and it's like,
yeah. Also in marketing, I think it became
sure, and I can get
marketing
behind that
thing.
for sure.
Because like universities, because I remember my university where I was going to, you know, comics, you know, a lot of my professors liked them. But when they decided to start the illustration program and then they were going to have comics, well, we can't say comics, it's like graphic novels.
Right.
That sounds more legit. Like,
Yeah.
I can charge you money for graphic novels.
Yeah, you're more likely to get a bank loan if you call yourself a graphic novelist.
Right. That's true. That's true. Well, my wife teaches high school art, and she teaches a cartooning class, and she's like, I need to rename this class because they just stick in every kid who's a problem with me because it's just the doodling class, right? And yeah, and so she's like, I got to call it sequential storytelling or something,
right?
And just I don't know, give myself a better pick of students.
All those troublemaking cartoonists.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that shows that there's like these terms have weight to them. You know what I mean? And I think cartoonists have struggled with what we call ourselves for a long time, and it's just getting more muddy because once we have to go outside of the village, and you understand that people react differently to the things you say. So, you know.
But I don't know about you guys, but man, when I'm talking to people who are like, you know, accountants or whatever, they think it's cool as hell that I'm a comic book artist or a cartoonist or whatever I call myself. You know. And I mean, of course, their questions are like, "Well, have you made anything that was turned into a movie?" Right,
you
know, or whatever, you know, something irrelevant, kind of. But
that is considered, I still think, the pinnacle of your success as a cartoonist if somebody makes something else out of it.
But I also think there's a certain badge of honor of like, oh, did you ever make something that was in a movie that made like $100 million that you never saw a penny of?
checking off a lot of boxes there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, oh yeah, everybody's had one of those or whatever, you know, like, yeah, I created this character in a Batman story, and no, there's
and you know, just to that point, talking about titles, did you go through a period in maybe a couple, like a decade or so ago, when it wasn't this sweet to be a cartoonist? Because I feel like, you know, maybe the past 20 years, people have brightened to what we do. But, you know, there was a dark age to this too.
Right.
Right.
Well, I think that it took a minute for people to go like, oh yeah, comics are cool, you know, and they make all this like great pop culture, but then there's also Fun Home and stuff like that. And so like there had to be enough of those. You know, obviously there's always been Mouse, and there's always been Will Eisner's, and there's always been like, but there was finally enough to go, oh, graphic novels are a lot of different things, plus manga, you know, and all that stuff. And now it's like, oh, it's a big thing that I almost can't even get a whole view of. And I think that's a nice change from 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. And I do think that them making those movies for the last, 16, 17 years now, that puts comics daily on Yahoo, on, you know, in media, and everybody talks about it in the same way they talk about other aspects of pop culture. Mostly about how much things make. Like, I was just cruising the internet before we came on, and, you know, it's all about Barbieheimer and how much it's made and how much this made and how much that didn't make. And nobody used to talk about comic books like that, except maybe when like Superman came out in like 1978.
Yeah, I mean, completely inflated and false stuff. I mean, you know, like, it's Death of Superman made it. Yeah, they sold a gajillion copies because every store bought 70 of them. You know, or whatever.
Right.
But you still didn't read about it on Yahoo. Yeah. There might have been a blurb. Superman died, and then, you know, now to the river burning in Cleveland. Right. You know?
Right. Or the Biff Bam Pow comics aren't just for kids anymore. Like, they kept trying. You know, and then
like, now you don't read that anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an incredible step forward.
Yeah, everybody bristles when you see an article where it's got the zap, bow, pam, bam, boom in it.
And music. Like, anytime they'd bring any cartoonist on, they'd have the Batman music. But I don't draw Batman. Right. You know, no, you're a cartoonist. We got it. You know.
You're going to love this. We're going to have you come through a panel.
Right. That's right.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, we're gonna run one of those new filters on your face so you look like you're made out of pencils.
Like
Right.
a Lichtenstein, man. Yeah, the aha filter.
Yeah,
Like-
the filter right now.
Xander, going slowly stepping through your career a little bit. Talk a little bit about slave labor and in NEC. Because I had a thought about NEC, and for a lot of people who may not be familiar, that was kind of like the birthplace of the Tick. And Ben Edlund was doing that, and I remember your Chainsaw Vigilante books. And there's something I was thinking about, which kind of permeated into the late 90s, into the early aughts, was randomness came into popular culture. Like, you know, you'd be at a show and somebody was like, can you draw Mr. T like wrestling the Dukes of Hazzard on a moped? And just like, what? And I remember how absurd the Tick was, and I loved every minute of it. It was such a fresh parody on things, and you hadn't really seen things like that. So when you were doing Chainsaw Vigilante, did you feel like this was a new lane to maybe do storytelling in that didn't take itself so seriously?
Yeah.
Like how did you approach that?
The Tick, I think, was so incredible too, because it was like, it's not like that hadn't been done before. I mean, there had been many superhero parodies, but I mean, Ben's vision, or Ben's sort of like abilities were so honed, even as young as he was, and like that was, it's kind of incredible that had sort of like edged everybody out of like the the superhero parody thing for a time. And and I mean, of course I was so young that I was like, yeah, I've been reading all these superhero comics for all this time, and I've got some funny ideas for for my satirical parody of this and that, and and it's like it's hit and miss. It's some good moments, but it doesn't hang together entirely. But yeah, I mean, it sure was fun to be able to say like, oh, I can have a hint at a superhero adventure, or an homage to something that I always loved, but make it silly, make it sort of over the top, make it sort of, take it to a ridiculous extreme, that kind of stuff. And that was great, and that, because I think that had flavored even all of my favorite comics growing up, like Gru and Ninja Turtles, and like all that stuff was, kind of born out of parody, and then became their own thing. Right. Cerebus was another big one, actually. Yeah, all that stuff had basically been like straight parody at the very beginning, and then kind of settled into its own lane.
I think it's sort of interesting because that had existed for a long time, since the 50s, because of Mad. And then I think
Mad was
the Ninja Turtles, not just being like Mad would do the one shot and then that'd be it. They would go through and parody each thing. Superman, Batman, whatever. Then the Ninja Turtles parodying Frank Miller's Daredevil, but then it caught with an audience who wasn't aware of the source material it was parodying. And then it continued and became a huge like gravity shifting independent book at a time when that was not the norm. So like that broke down. So then you had other things like like you said, like the Tick, or
the adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters.
Exactly. And everybody was then doing a 3 adjective description
trigger of some kind.
Yeah. But none of that stuck. So I'm sort of interested in that in a way, because some parodies stick and become their own thing, like the Tick or the Turtles, and other things like you're parodying things in Replacement God. And then you did 36 issues, you said?
Oh, no, Replacement God was maybe 14 issues. But
14 issues, okay. Yeah. But that's a long run for an independent book.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So you may have the root, which might have some parodying or poking fun at something. But it has to have something more for it to continue to run, or, it's just a joke, Like, we make fun of Superman's underwear on the outside, and, we do the Super Duper Man thing. You know?
Well, and I mean, this is jumping forward, but KAIJUMAX, which is it's a parody. I mean, it's a satire. It's giant monsters go to prison, you know, but the prison is like Oz, you know, so it's like there's gangs and drugs and like murder, all that sort of stuff. And I knew like, oh yeah, like jokes are going to get me through 6 issues easy, you know, like that all the prison tropes and all the monster tropes. And I mean, you just mush them all together and you got a bunch of gags. But I knew that I wanted to do it for longer. And so, yeah, like you have to give it its own life. You have to give these characters like, oh yeah, this character starts as, you know, a viewpoint character or a character that sort of represents this idea or this sort of philosophy. But then they have to become real characters and you have to care about what they want and what they achieve and all that sort of stuff. Or else, yeah, like you say, Mike, it's just gonna peter out and people are gonna be like, yeah, haha, like whatever, somebody gets shanked in the shower and it's like with a tree or whatever. I don't know. Some stupid hacky monster joke.
And I wanted to, I hope we didn't jump too fast through Replacement Guy, but one of the things, and this is, I've tried to embarrass you in the past about this, that me and Michael Ringo would talk a lot about Replacement Guy. And Mike would talk about how it's one of his favorite books.
Oh, wow.
And we were like, yo, did you get the double-sized one? He was like, yeah, I know, it was fantastic. And, you know, I don't know if he ever reached out to you or you ever had a conversation.
No, I never met Mike. And he had drawn like a really great picture, maybe like 6 months before he died, like of the main character, Newt, from the book. And I was like, oh man, that's so good. Wow. And, you know, and I've been reading his Fantastic Four with Mark Waid, and that was great. Anyway. So yeah, no, I never did get to meet him.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And like one of the greatest things I loved about Replacement God is one, even though, and I was going to ask you about kind of if you wound up getting grouped into other fantasy books around that time, because I was thinking about what else was kind of out around that time, like maybe Linda Medley stuff or Akiko or things like that might have been in the same vein, and it's not necessarily.
Yeah, Castle Waiting, Akiko. Thieves and Kings.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and I mean, Bone was, you know, in the stratosphere.
Yeah.
Service was in the stratosphere. Like none of those stuff was like related to us, but like, and I mean, you know, and of course the fantasy of Sandman and and that stuff. But yeah, I mean, I feel like there were a couple things that were starting to happen then. But you know, again, like I said, it's like fantasy wasn't like a cool genre or anything. It was elves and weirdos and stuff, and like not cool and awesome like superheroes.
Yeah. So, and how many issues of Replacement Guy?
So I did eight with slave labor. I did 5 with Image, and I did 1 self-published.
Okay.
Which, yeah. So.
And maybe another thing just about all of this, and all these iterations of you working, how many of those points were you self-publishing the entire thing yourself?
Just that one. And I was like, no way.
That was enough.
Never again. It's just, I just don't have the brain. I don't have the brain for it. Like I don't have the.
Yeah. Well, can we talk about that for a second? Because it seemed like I don't want to
talking about ADHD. Yeah, let's do it.
Revisit traumas, but so it maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong. So you were basically trying to wrap this up, and you self-published like the last book. Is that kind of
yeah? But I intended to keep going, but it was too much. And that was when Top 10 happened, and so I mean. And then you kind of think like, I could probably do both. I mean, are you kidding me? Like only a 27-year-old would have that kind of confidence, you know?
Yeah.
So I, you know, and it's like, it just has always been this thing that like, yeah, I'll get to it in just a sec. By the time I'm 30, 40, 50,
Yeah. And that period of time, I'm thinking this is what, like the late 90s, maybe like 99 or something like that, right? And printing was a whole different beast back then. To self-publish it in the late 90s was a different thing than like print on demand now or going to Ingram Spark.
I've still got boxes. If you want a copy, come on by.
Yeah.
I can give you about 60. No more.
I'll ring the bell. Yeah. So, to that point, and, it's almost like we're talking about ancient history now, saying that, oh, before the internet, you had to just like go visit a printer, or maybe if you had a really good Kinko's guy in your town, because most of them didn't know how to do this stuff.
No, yeah, no. This got printed at like a proper publisher, like I think
Yeah.
the same one that they had been using at Image. I just talked to the people and got the number, so I never visited or anything. It was just like, and you're sending originals, because I mean, I wasn't sending them scans; they were just sending originals, and they were like scanning them on a drum scanner or some nonsense. And you're like, I hope this goes okay. But the cover is printed like off center because I had a bleed element, and they kind of like they centered it like to the very edge of that bleed element. So the whole thing's a mess. I mean, the things that went right are miraculous. The things that went wrong were so obvious in retrospect.
So you had never, because that's also something I think that's really important at that time, is that if you self-published, then like I started working in a printer when I was 15, so I understood how to do all that. But a lot of artists didn't have that experience and had no idea, like, once the drawing is done, like, where does the magic people that make this into a book kind of thing, right?
The keyboard elves, right?
Right, yeah. And there's a lot of technical things, like making sure that you draw your pages the right size, understanding the language of the printer, knowing, well, I like this paper, but I don't like this paper. What is this paper called?
Mm-hmm.
What do I tell the printer to make sure that I get what I want? And some people really love that. That's part of their bandwidth. They enjoy, I'm going to build a ship in a bottle, right? They enjoy that whole process. Other artists are like, I just want to draw, and I want somebody else to do that because that's not my wheelhouse. And I think that's an important demarcation for you as an artist, and especially if you ever desire to self-publish, that you actually don't have to know now, because
right.
There were fewer printers who would print black and white comics back in the day, right?
Oh,
like Brenner Printing and places like that I used, right?
Shout out to Brenner Printing.
Right. Now, there's a ton of printers who can print your comic 36 copies in 24 hours, put it on a pallet, and mail it out to you.
That's wild. I mean, I've missed out on that whole revolution because I'm like, I want somebody else to take care of that. I'm interested into it. I'm interested in the inner workings up to a point, but at a certain point, I'm like, after I trap the lines with, with that sort of 60, 40, 40, 0. It's like, it's like, I'll do it, but I'm not happy about it.
Like the old fisherman, trap your lines!
Trap your lines.
Like,
so I mean, and and it was a really interesting and a really illuminating process. And I remember I didn't want to pay the money for a full color scan of the front cover, so I did a computer colored one that I didn't know how to do. So a friend of mine sort of showed me how to do it, and he did most of it. Like I kind of did the roughs, and he colored it, and it was like, oh yeah, that's pretty good. Like, yeah, it's all right, and we kind of figured it out from there. But like, it was. I don't know. I mean, in a way, all those limitations, sometimes those limitations really ignite creativity in people, and they didn't they would for me, but I wasn't trying to do that. Like I wasn't trying to do an experimental sort of formalist exercise. I was trying to just do a funny comic book. And so sometimes those are just obstacles, and they were not fun, the way that they would if you were experimenting.
Xander, let's do a lateral move. Talk about your entry into doing comic book conventions.
Oh,
so
so this summer I somebody asked me at a panel I was on, like, well, how many times have you done Comic-Con? I'm like, well, it's funny, this is my 30th year.
Wow.
For San Diego Comic-Con. So I first went in 2004, and I think that the only show I'd been to before that was maybe I've been to Chicago Con like 2 weeks before that or something like that. It was, but yeah, I was just wandering around, and that was the thing about that time. They like people would be assigned artist alley tables, but they wouldn't sit at them, you know, because they had other things to do. And so I just squatted at a table and I just sat some of my comics. And they weren't even done. I mean, I think I might have had some Chainsaw Vigilante comics, but I didn't. I had like photocopies of Replacement God #1, and I showed it to Paul Guinan and Anina Bennett, you know, just as like to kill time because I was wandering around. And Paul gave me this unbelievably like generous, you know, review, and not review, but like
a crit
portfolio review. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, so generous with his time. Like, and, you know, of course, like there was a lot of dead time at San Diego Comic-Con back when there were 30,000 people there instead of 200,000.
300 million, right?
Yeah, approximately 300 million. Yeah. But yeah, and so I mean, it was great. And and then I was sitting at my little, you know, squatting at my artist alley table, and who's sitting next to me? Paul Chadwick. So I'm just shooting the breeze with him, my favorite cartoonist in the world. Okay, yeah, that's great.
That's
so yeah, I mean, it was. And I mean, of course, there I met Clay Nee and you know, and I've known her ever since, and like all the other people there, and yeah, I mean, I've always really enjoyed San Diego Comic-Con, and now it's like I have an artist alley space, and I can't give it up. Like,
yeah, it's like rent control. You can't get that.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, that's I guess that's the difference. Back then, you could give it up and probably get it back, and now you know if you ever give anything up.
Yeah, you'd have to pull strings to get it back if you. I mean, because I didn't go one year because I was overseas, and so I, you know, but I was like, please, pretty please, can I have my spot back? So, but it worked once.
So to that point, Xander, you don't at this point in your career, do you not do a lot of kind of like local or regional conventions? You just do San Diego?
I've just started to do more regional shows. Like there's a show in Sioux Falls, South Dakota that's called SuperCon, but SIOUX.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. And so yeah, they're really nice. Like they kind of have contacted our studio. We have a studio of you know 10 people, and so they were like, yeah, you guys can all come out as guests. And so it's like, yeah, that's great, and it's a nice little show and a nice little convention center, and yeah, I like doing those. I mean, you know, obviously the pandemic's thrown everything off, but I mean, I used to do C2E2 all the time. I used to do New York Comic Con a lot. I just went to Heroes for the first time this year, and my mind was blown. Like that's the greatest thing. I mean, especially when it's like I was doing commissions and stuff. It's like that is the place to go if you want to sell commissions. My God,
absolutely.
You know, like yeah, it's just I couldn't do them fast enough. You know, and people were like, really, it's that cheap? And I'm like, I thought I was totally overcharging, but yes, you know, all right, next year, we're doing this.
Fantastic. The price goes up next year. I love it. So getting back on the comics train, do you want to talk about Top 10 a little bit?
Oh yeah. So yeah, Gene Ha had moved from Chicago to to Minneapolis, where I lived, and so he was. He had an assistant on Top 10 to do backgrounds just because it was going to be so labor intensive as it always ended up being. And I was like, well, you know, and he's like, but that wasn't working out. So he's like, well, do you want to work with me? And I'm like, I don't know if backgrounds are what I don't know if I could do them like you do. No one could do things like Gene Ha does. I mean, he's a singular talent. And so, we had talked about maybe sort of like dividing things up by like, because like there were kind of different styles in that world. Like things could be more cartoony or things could be a little more realistic, but we didn't feel like that was going to be an efficient use of the time. And so what ended up happening is that I just ended up doing layouts, and I would sort of do the storytelling and then the word balloons and block everything out and give Gene a running start. Cause I mean, he's definitely struck with the blank page itis, you know, and that's hard to get over. And I'm not because my stuff's so simple. Like I don't, you know, a finished drawing doesn't represent as much time sunk into it as for me as it does for Gene. So I'm not as paralyzed by that. So, and then I ended up working on that. You know, I ended up working on that all the way through. And then he did 49ers and I did SMAX. You know, just because like we kind of grandfathered into these other projects, and then Gene and I worked on a Top 10 series that Alan Moore didn't write, so that was no pressure to writing after to continuing from Alan Moore. It's just like no big deal or anything. And and then so I mean it was a great process. Alan is very, I mean, I think that people sort of like give him this reputation of being this old crank or this sort of like grouchy guy, and it's like, yeah, I mean, when you're a comics journalist or a DC editor, I bet you do think that he's quite grumpy. If you are a fellow creator, he's as personable as you could possibly be. I mean, like obviously there aren't a lot of venues where you can run into him. Right. So it's not like he's a person you just run into casually, but I always found him to be absolutely delightful and absolutely personable and just a great person. And his storytelling, I mean, it was unimpeachable. And so you almost didn't have to, like, you could kind of coast, I mean, obviously you want to do your best, but like he had worked out all the details, so you could just kind of execute his stuff. And in that way, sometimes it's not the most like just knocking those things out. It's not the most creatively fulfilling thing if your main thing is storytelling and visual storytelling, but as opposed to like putting details in the background. Like if your thing is putting details in the background, it was great because he would call for some, you'd have to think of some, like there's a lot of that going on. But yeah, it was a dream job for sure.
How was sliding into the collaborative process for you? Because it seemed like you have done a lot of things, whole hog yourself, but now you're in a place where you're kind of working with a group. Was that complicated for you at first? Did you just slide right into it?
I mean, a little bit. I think that there was a lot of crossover stuff. Like people were kind of doing the same thing. Like Alan was writing all this stuff and kind of dictating a lot of visual storytelling stuff. And then I was doing a lot of visual storytelling stuff on top of that. And then Gene was sort of like re-rendering things to fit his aesthetic. And so I felt like there was maybe a little bit of, a little bit of extra heat generated with all the extra work that was being done. Yeah. But I mean, it was great once we had sort of figured out our deal. Once Gene and I had sort of figured out our deal, where it's like, I'm going to just do these layouts. You follow them as best as you know how. And I mean, because he would feel like, oh, you framed these people so that they both fit in the frame, but you do know that this person's like 3 feet taller than this other person. And I'm like, yeah, but don't you think that we could? No, we're gonna have to reframe this so that we're looking from the ground, And it's like, yeah, okay, great. I mean, as much as I'm also the artist, he's the artist on the book, and so I was just like, whatever you want to do, that's great.
It sounds very similar to Kurtzman doing the layouts for the guys in DC. And there's certain artists that did well with that, like Severin and Wood. Sure. And other guys like Kubert and Toth, they didn't, because they got their own mojo, and it didn't gel with them. Well, yeah, you think about what John Severin's going to add to it. It's like all this detail, these wrinkles, and all this sort of stuff. What's Toth going to add to it? A perfect layout. What's he going to add to it? I mean, there's going to be like 11 more lines. Right.
11 fewer lines.
Right.
Yeah. Fewer lines. He's going to erase some. Yeah.
And I think that certain artists like Kubert or Toth, the layout and their mind, where they're going to block out something, is equal to somebody like Kurtzman, just as powerful. So it's like you can't have Hitchcock and Kubrick work on the same film.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like,
that's just the doubling of the jobs, and you're just like, well, yeah, you're spending all this time sort of fighting each other, or both, or just overlapping. Yeah.
Right. So I think it's sort of interesting that, and maybe because your style is so different from Gene's style, that if you can concentrate on, a good example, if it's a 2-shot, a cartoonist who draws in a style similar to yours might put them both in the same frame. But Gene, who's more maybe of an illustrator, might be thinking of the dynamics of these shapes as opposed to the beats of storytelling, right? That's what That's what I see. Sometimes I observe between someone who we would say was a cartoonist as opposed to somebody who was more of an illustrator.
Yeah, I mean, I really felt like I want to tell the whole story in composition, and because I don't usually, I mean, I'm a pretty good artist, but I don't really like to draw my way out of a bad composition. You know what I mean? Like, but and so like I really feel like, I really wanted to play with like the size dynamics, but also like let's have some really neutral panels to sort of let your eye rest. This isn't all like, especially Top 10, which was not an action comic. It was a very sedate comic in terms of storytelling. I want a lot of like symmetrical panels that sort of like let us sort of like take in some of the details and not have things blasting out at our eyeballs all the time. And I think that was and that was a little bit of it wasn't a battle or anything, but those were we were pushing and pulling a little bit in that way, because he was such a he was sort of a 90s comic book artist, at the time, and I think that, that came with a lot of like expectations for how much power every panel was going to have.
Right.
We have a question from the room. One of our pencil to pencil lifers who's been with us for years, Eternity Forever, asks, and I don't my history of top 10 is not great, so you tell me if this is on the right track. Was it daunting to write top 10 after Moore, and did you try to keep your writing style closer to how he wrote it?
First of all, no, not at all daunting, because how hard could it be, right? Yeah, it was totally daunting. It was, I think that I probably didn't even realize how terrifying it was at the time, so that it's good because I didn't let it get in my head. Mm-hmm. And I did try to write I was kind of picking up on a lot of like weird little sort of idiosyncrasies that he has. I mean, it's funny when I've been reading Alan Moore's scripts for a long time, you start to notice things that you don't necessarily see in the comics, even though they're right there. They're there in the comics now once you look for them. But it's like he would do a lot of these things I would always call right turns. Like instead of like a left turn, where like something weird and random happens, it's like he would kind of go, characters would sort of go off on a tangent on a certain page, but then by the last panel, he's like, no, this has got to stay on the track. And so he would just like wrench this, like this character be like, yeah. Incidentally, did you know that we have to go do this thing? And he would do that all the time. And I was like, that's a great idea. Like that's, it's a little awkward and a little mannered, but it's also like, boy, it keeps your story going, And and there were a lot of like ways that the characters would talk. I mean, there's a lot of sort of awkward phrasing that I felt like was kind of better that it was awkward than if it were like really like how people actually talk. Like there were, I kept having people say like, good to know you instead of good to meet you. And it's like, I don't know why, but it just it stuck in my head, and it kind of worked in this because everything about Top 10 was just a little bit mannered and a little bit weird, and everybody was talking about weird stuff. They were casually mentioning whatever, a dragon biting the subway or whatever. And so I like that there was sort of like a little strange things about the dialogue that would kind of stick out. I don't know.
Would you sort of say that that's sort of like a British thing? Like sort of
I think so. I mean, or, British writing American sort of slang or idioms. Yeah. I mean, and so even if it was like something that he didn't intentionally do, I was like, screw it, I'm doing it anyway. It's fun. I mean, it's almost like it's the Top 10 style, a beloved comic book. Well, I'm going to stick to it. So
right,
that's great.
Cool. Thanks, Eternity. And there's another question from Doy, who says, did you work at all on the Top 10 sequel with the other Top 10 spinoff not worked on by you guys in mind? Or did you go straight from your last issue of SMAX?
I'm sorry to Jerry Ordway and Paul DiFilippo. I didn't take that into account. Mainly because we pitched it before that came out. But also it's like that was a time jump of like 5 years. And so ours was taking place like literally right after the last issue of SMAX. And so technically none of that stuff had happened yet. So, and when they said that, I was like, well, good. That's fine. And I read it and I made sure that we weren't going to do anything that was going to mess it up. But I was happy to not sort of have to tie in all this extra stuff that we hadn't worked on.
Oh, fantastic. Cool. Thanks. Thanks so much. That was a nice little interlude. I enjoyed that. Hey, Xander, you want to share some art? How you feel about that?
Oh yeah, let's let me see here.
And while Xander pulls this up, I want to thank anybody who has followed Xander in on his Slipstream. One of my favorite things about having the guest artist kind of signal boost is that we get some new eyeballs on the channel, and hope you stay around, like and subscribe. We do this every week, y'all. This is must-see internet.
That's right, must-see internet.
Right.
If there is such a thing, yes.
So, did you hit present?
Yeah, I've got. So I hit the. I'll hit the present. Let's see.
Yeah, I don't see it. Yeah, let's try that again.
Share screen. Share screen. Chrome tab. There we go. So, yeah. So I put together, just when you asked me to put together some artwork, I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, here we go. And so I just put in some random panels or commissions, recent commissions. Let's see. That was from KAIJUMAX, Baba Yaga's house, which we kind of figured was technically a mech.
Fantastic.
Like, sure, yeah, that's right. And my mom is she has a big thing about Baba Yaga and like chicken feet in general, and so that was my little homage to her, because she's a quilter. She does a lot of stuff with Baba Yaga. So anyway, and I'm sure that she's like, yeah, thanks for putting it in your weird like R-rated monster prison comic that has a satanic nun and blood and guts. Yeah, I like that.
Xander, do you have a team on your other parts of your process, or are you doing all the coloring and lettering yourself?
I had a color assistant in KAIJUMAX. That was Jason Fisher, and he's so overqualified for that job, but he crushed it. I mean, he helped me so much. I mean, all the color is basically mine, but I mean, he said he had to count one time, but there were like 300 distinct characters in KAIJUMAX by the end. Some of it were like different versions of the same character, but like 300 different like character, like color color schemes that he had to learn or remember or like have on file, and I sure didn't remember any of that stuff. Cow. So I mean, so like, and a lot of times I just put a new character in there, and I'm like, and they'd be like, I got to remember to tell Jason how this guy's colored, but he would just color it like the way he figured, and I was like, yeah, that's about right. Like he was so good. So yeah,
it's a good harmony to have. Yeah.
Oh, it's really great. And I mean, yeah, his stuff is fantastic. Yeah. So anyway, KAIJUMAX, I had all these random panels. Here's one where they were parodying Hamilton. And they had a rap musical that was telling the story of the first Godzilla movie. And I got to give at San Diego Comic-Con, I got to give a copy of that comic to Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was dressed as Deadpool.
Oh wow! There's a couple of steps to that. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, oh yeah. And so here's like more commissions and stuff like that. I don't know why I'm putting this stuff up. Just
it's lovely. It's lovely.
This was I did this for Brad at Oni, but where it's fighting a dark horse.
I see what you did there.
Yeah.
That's cool.
More commissions. Yeah, people always want me to draw Ultraman or the Toxic Avenger. That was also for Brad.
Do you do a lot of commissions, Andrew?
You know what? I never used to, but now I do a ton because like, and I usually do them like this, where it's like it's a single figure, minimal background watercolor, and it's like, I always found it so hard to do commissions and have them kind of be worth it. What I was charging, whatever it was at the time. But I felt like once I do watercolor, it's now that I've done 1,000 pages of KAIJUMAX, I have a pretty good sense for color, and so I felt like that was making it into sort of like something that felt like a real piece of art instead of just like a sketch of Batman or whatever. Right. And so yeah, I've really just started like in the last, since I finished KAIJUMAX and I had the time, I've started to do them a lot more, and it's actually really fun.
Do you have a transition from like, say, doing work on, and we haven't talked about your actual pen to paper style if you're working digitally or not. But do you enjoy doing watercolor versus marker or something like that?
I don't know why I'm echoing. Sorry.
Something happened. That's what we'll figure it
out. But like I mean, I did all of KAIJUMAX digitally, and I pretty much do anything that's going to be in mainstream comics digitally now because it's so much faster and it's so much easier to fix if you mess up or if if you didn't pay attention to something in the script and then they tell you like, oh, that's supposed to be in there, you could fix it. And obviously I do my commissions that are just on paper, and that's fun, and I really like that change. But I feel like if I were going to do a comic that wasn't digital, I'd really want it to. I almost wouldn't want to do it on pen and ink because it's like I can get a cleaner line digitally. I'd rather make it be something that you could see the thumbprints in it, basically. Like if it was watercolor, colored pencil, or that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. There you go. I knew there was more. That's
cool. So this is just another page from KAIJUMAX of the something grotesque happening.
Well, you know what, Xander, while you're in here, maybe tell us about KAIJUMAX and how all that got started.
Yeah, so I mean, it's initially I had thought, I just wanted to do a giant monster comic because obviously they were fun. My son really liked the show Ultraman when he was really little. We had it on DVD, and when he was 2 years old, he was running around and like doing the little beam with his hands, and and he thought that was great. And so I watched those episodes like a million times. And you start, once you are a cartoonist and a storyteller, you start thinking of like, wonder what these monsters are doing when they're not doing the regular monster stuff. And I kind of thought about like, what about if there was a bar that they would hang out at? And I thought, it's a little hacky, and there's not enough of a story there. And so then I thought, well, what if there's a real deal prison? And that's when it started to really click with me. And I mean, I didn't, that kind of, the grittiness of that is not usually my style, but it stuck with me, and I liked how it started to become more of a. It started to become something that was kind of exciting to me, like that it had some depth, that there was a chance for pathos as well as like gags and things like that. And so initially I had pitched it to Oni with Ryan Brown, who is, you may know from God Hates Astronauts, Curse Words, 8 Billion Genies, and he has, he had this grotesque monstery style, and I was like, this would be great for him. And but I think that his Kickstarter had kind of like really picked up again, and I think that Image had picked up God Hates Astronauts. Anyway, so it just wasn't going to work. And so Charlie Chu at Oni at the time said, "Do you want to draw it?" And I'm like, "Oh God, no, that sounds like way too much work." And I was right; it was way too much work.
1,000 pages later.
Yeah, but I did do it anyway. So I mean, and obviously it's absolutely been worth it. It was the project of a lifetime, where I could set up and pay off all my little stories, and and have characters that, I mean, one of the big things about this that was such a change for me is that when I was doing comics in the 90s, it's like people go like, oh, that comic, yeah, it's good, it's fine. Whereas this was a comic where I could do this and people be like, oh, I hate that character, or oh my gosh, that character is so sad, oh, I love him, I wish I could take him home and pet his little head or whatever. And you're like, oh, that's a different thing than like somebody just kind of going, yeah, that comic's good. It's like somebody is having an emotional reaction, is having to the experience that I'm creating. And that's a big deal to me. And so
is that something you discovered in the process, or is that something you set out to do when you started it?
I mean, it's always something I set out to do, but I think that probably coincided with like, social media and like, and being able to see what was happening, and like people could respond instead of having to write you a 2-page letter or whatever, put a stamp on it or some nonsense. but like that people could really sort of respond to that and say like, oh my gosh, I really love that character. That was a big deal for me, where it's like, oh yeah, like that's better to me than like drawing a nice picture, because as nicely as I can draw, there's 1,000 people better, like the way that I'm going to draw Batman, 1,000 people can do it better than I can, and so I love that doing something where it's like, well, this is the thing that only I could do, is to take something, and not only I can do, but I mean, this is my style, which is like, let's take something that's utterly absurd and turn it into the saddest thing you've ever read, and there's worse things to be known for, I guess. And so yeah, it was certainly a turning point in my career, and I mean and also it's like, when you have a book that people associate with your name, that's a big deal, like that, to have people sort of like think of your name and the name of a comic in the same thought or the same breath. That's perfect.
Well, that's sort of what the ideal thing is for a cartoonist. People are coming to you for you. Like if they're coming for you on Batman, well, it might be you, but it's also because it's
yeah.
Right,
Yeah, and I mean, and like Batman certainly raises people's profile, and that's great. But it's also like, yeah, do they follow you when you leave Batman to go do, your sad monster comic? Maybe not. But yeah, it depends. I mean, depends on a lot of factors.
Our good buddy Notorious JRD asks, Xander, are you a fan of Jeff Darrow?
I'm a fan and a friend of Jeff Darrow. He is a delightful person. Yeah, he was always one of the people that I would stop by his booth at San Diego. And he and I had sat next to each other at a Chicago Comic-Con years ago, and like, that was one of the first people that I met and like blew my mind with all these comic stories. But yeah, I love his stuff. But I mean, again, it's like he's this person who can like do this drawing that tells 1,000 tales in this one picture, and I aspire to that, but boy, yeah, he's got it nailed.
Do you enjoy doing, this is kind of a weird, kind of going off of the Jeff Darrow thing, do you enjoy drawing big epic pages, or do you like quiet moments, or do you like a nice blend of things? As I know, there's a lot of people who always want to know like how many Easter eggs you're hiding and things. And like, is that a part of your process at all?
I love doing Easter eggs, and I mean, mainly I don't like. I think about details in the backgrounds as being like they have to either be, texture to really provide, to provide your eye with something to look at, or they have to be sort of like environmental storytelling, so that you can kind of like tell something more about the scene that you're in. And I never want to just do something because it's like, oh, I just got to match the level of detail on this and this. It's like I want there to be something to look at. So yeah, I love doing these epic, large things where it's like I can put in a lot of silly little things. The problem is a lot of times I don't like drawing giant scenes that are intact, like an intact city. I'd just be like, oh, why? This is terrible. But a city in ruins, now that's fun to draw, because then you don't have to go, then no one's going to look at that and then be like, I don't know if that building has like enough parking, or I don't know if that like that street actually continues around that corner. Be like, yeah, I know, I wasn't thinking, like it's completely inconsistent. So I like things to be destroyed so that you don't have to think about that stuff.
That's fantastic. Yeah, let's see some more stuff.
All right, let's get back to that.
And you know what? With your Game Informer cover, maybe before you jump off of that, after I just asked you to turn the page, do you get a lot of like freelance work, or is it something that just falls in your lap once in a while?
That I don't typically, especially during KAIJUMAX, I didn't have the time. But Game Informer is here in Minneapolis, and so I did their. Well, this says Game Informer because that was my placeholder, but it's Game Enfarcer. It's like an interior gag, like April Fool's section.
Yeah.
And so I did the cover for it for 16 years.
Wow.
And so this is the last one I did, where they were like, "We're going out with a bang." It's his kaiju size Resident Evil lady.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it was so much fun because it's like, oh yeah, like KAIJUMAX, it's like as much as I can put details in it, the clock's always ticking. I gotta keep going. So it's nice with this. I could spend a week and a half sort of futzing with it and put in little details and funny little gags and looking up more stuff about Resident Evil and whatever. And I mean, and sometimes it was I had played all the Resident Evils, so that was fun. But like sometimes it was something that I didn't know anything about, and I had to just research the hell out of it, just to kind of keep up. I wasn't even really trying to impress anybody. I was just trying to get a C+. And so in terms of its jokes and all that stuff. So, I always try to get an A+ for drawing.
No, that's fantastic. I had maybe a couple other questions about just your art style. You, especially with your pen and ink stuff, are you a brush guy, or you do a little bit of like brush pens? What are you usually landing on when you're doing things on paper? I mean,
every project I do it differently. Like that's almost what chooses the project for me. Not chooses it for me, but like that's what I'll have to like settle into something for each project. And so when I did the book Heck, which is the one right before KAIJUMAX, I was working at print size, and then I also had I was also drawing with a brush. Like a brush pen. It was called a Pentel pocket brush pen. Yep. So it's pretty long bristles, and it's a little hard to control. And so that gave it sort of a roughness that I liked. And I mean, of course, it was fast. And so that was the thing that I liked most about it, because I was doing each page in an hour and a half or something like that, from blank to fully inked and lettered. So and that was giving it a sort of that and the brush and all that, and like the sort of the cheap tools and the cheap paper was giving it sort of an immediacy, which I really liked. If I'm going to be, I did replacement guide with brush, like Winsor & Newton, like real brush, real ink, and on big paper, and it was nice. KAIJUMAX is all digital. I'm working on a new series that hasn't sort of come through yet, but it's going to be digital, but a different digital brush, so that it has a little bit more flex to it, and there's a little bit more cross hatching, and yeah. So I mean, I really like to change up what I'm using, and then let that sort of give me some ideas, because a lot of times it's just the limitations that will give you the ideas. Where you're like, I can't, like in Heck, I was like, I can't do the details that, to make this story about hell be like the awesome, like heavy metal cover hell. So it ended up being this very dark, very sort of featureless, bleak hell instead.
What is your digital setup or your rig you're using mostly these days?
Well, I have I have a tower computer that I've kind of like, I didn't build it, but I keep like rebuilding it and changing out the graphics card and stuff like that. And so I can, kind of keep it moving pretty fast. But it's funny because my son builds this PC for like gaming, proper gaming. Yeah. And so his old crappy, graphics card, like I was like, well, do you need this? And I put it in and I like looked it up against mine that I had my like professional PC. It is like 1,000 times better. Like literally the benchmarks are like, it's 700 to 1,000 times better depending on what test you use. I'm like,
you're going to be playing Fortnite instead of working. So.
Yeah, I mean, I know myself. There's not a game on there. Like I even had to take the solitaire off. Like, no way. We can't be doing it. The internet's bad enough.
We're gonna have to talk. I'm a gamer too. It's a problem sometimes. Yeah. I love this. So, what programs are you using? Are you a Clip Studio guy?
I do Photoshop? Clip Studio for inking and lettering, and I hand letter even on the screen, that's the most absurd thing. So like, but I sort of assemble everything in Photoshop, and this is the embarrassing thing. It's Photoshop CS5, which must be 17 years old now. I mean, it's crazy old.
I know so many people who use that. So many.
We paid for it.
Yeah.
Like I don't want to have to get a subscription to Photoshop. But anyway, the problem was that when I got my new graphics card and I got my new Cintiq, which is a 4K screen, Photoshop has never heard of a 4K screen and has definitely never heard of my graphics card. And so the menus, I'm like, what does that say? I can't read it. Like it's too small. And then also it doesn't use the graphics. You can't use the graphics card to like rotate the screen or whatever. It's like I got to do it. I got to go to the next one. It's irritating. But yeah. So I use Photoshop to kind of put everything together, and I use InDesign to keep things straight. But then I use Clip Studio for sort of the comic booky aspect of it, like the nice lettering, the nice inking. That's a much better tool for that.
So, you know what? Like one of the things that we for a long time, Graphicsly was one of our sponsors, and we all sing the gospel of Clip Studio Paint around here. And there's a couple of still people who are holding off from using it. But one of the things I fell in love with Clip was even when it was Manga Studio. Was just how good the inking was, and when I was trying to force Photoshop to do the same thing, it just seemed so laborious. And
it would stair step in a weird way, and and like it was different when you were zoomed at different ways. Anyway, it almost drove me nuts because I was using Photoshop exclusively at first, and then I switched to Manga Studio a little ways in, and it's like, it's an unbelievable change.
Yeah, it feels very when I would work in Photoshop in the beginning, and I started with the regular non-Cintiq, Wacom, and you have to get used to looking at the screen but not your hand, which is like a whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And then now it's like the hybrid, because sometimes I look at the Cintiq, sometimes I look at the screen. I go sort of like back and forth. But the performance, you never have to worry about. It's never like, no. You're not doing Command Z or Control Z or whatever.
Well, it's amazing that computers have completely outpaced what we need years ago. Like you don't like an upgrade in your computer is like, I mean, it's nice, but like it didn't really do that much.
They just changed the palette. And you go like, well, wait a minute. My thing is over here. Now my thing is, where is my thing?
It just messed everything up.
Yeah. Every artist complains about that because it's like muscle memory, actually, right? You know your palettes, you know where everything is, you know where, you program your toggle, you get everything down. And then it's like, when you're working, it's flowing, and then all of a sudden the new version comes out, and it's like, wait a minute, and then you got to figure out how to go backwards or reshift. And I always feel like these companies do they ever have an artist in the room and go, okay, Joe, try it out, and like. Joe goes like, no, this is like janky. I don't like it.
Right.
And he gets it. He gets it in
try it out.
With the blow dart. Wrong answer, Joe.
Wrong answer. Bring the next guy in.
That's right.
I was going to ask, when you're working digitally, since you started working traditionally, and I know you said you'd like to change things up. Are there things that you miss or things that you feel you have to craft in a way that are not necessarily natural? Like when you use what I call meat world tools, a pen gives you a line, right?
Yeah.
A certain kind of pen gives you a certain kind of line. And you don't go in and program it, to whatever. And certain paper, certain thickness of ink, humidity will all give you a certain feel.
Yeah.
But when
Well, I'm really glad that humidity no longer has an effect, because that was exhausting every time that would happen. But yeah, I mean, I do wish. I mean, there are a lot of really good pens, and it take a lifetime to try them all. And I'm trying to, and of course, a lot of times it's like, I just kind of try them out for like a new project or a new illustration or something like that. And that's, I mean, that is fun. And I play with the knobs on the thing, and you go like, oh, okay, now when I go fast, it makes a thinner line in the middle. That's cool. All right, I'll try that a little bit. Oh, let's give it a little artificial like feathering when you go too fast, like it's not doing everything. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's really fun, but sometimes you're just like, well, if I want that effect, like even in a digital thing, if I want that effect, I'll just draw something really quick with the brush on paper, take a picture of it with my phone, and stick it in there, and like play with the threshold, and then there it is. Instead of having to play with all those tools.
Yeah, I just sort of that's one of the things I'm interested in when people go from one version to another version, and I sort of feel like I have to craft my line in a way that I don't when I work traditionally.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to match anything. I was just kind of letting the tool kind of dictate how things went, and I really just was being pretty simple. It was like thick line, thin line. That's all I'm going to do. And I played with them a little bit, but in a way, I just let that dictate how I was going to do it, because I just thought, especially when I was writing and drawing and everything, and I was just thinking about volume. I didn't want to play with it too much. I just wanted it to be simple. And it was kind of nice that like I was using a thick sort of solid line that Jason, who was flatting and doing the color stuff, was like, yeah, that's so easy. Like, it's so easy. It's not, you don't have to play with cross hatching. You don't have to play with anybody's like feathery little lines. You just, select it. Great.
And all of your work seems really solid. Like you don't have a lot of open lines and things like that. So it has to help the process along. Yeah.
Well, and the times that I've had to like, I did this cover, I got to quickly color it, so I need to flat it myself. It's like Photoshop makes it a lot easier when you only have to close a couple little lines, and then you can just kind of go paint bucket, paint bucket, paint bucket, paint bucket, run a filter, and
I love it. And another thing that we talk about a little bit on the live cast is kind of getting caught up in the kind of like, I don't know, what's hot and sexy in tech. And, like everybody wants a fresh brush pack, what I mean? But it's just like, normally, like you use what the program has, and, sometimes people say things like, I can't get that line because that's your line.
Right.
It's like, the brush pack's not helping that much.
Right.
Like you draw the way you draw.
Well, and I mean, I've bought a million packs. I'm like, oh, Ray Frendon's got a new pack out. Let me get it. And I get it, and I don't use it because I was doing my own, because I was finishing up a comic that I'd already started with this other brush. So
I found that that's something that younger cartoonists and young, especially teenagers, get all caught up in getting we're going to get all the new brush packs. We're going to get all these things.
We did too. We got all those pens. We bought them. We bought the pen points.
And then you find out that after a while you use a handful of pens, or maybe only one or two pens.
Yeah. It was the same. I did the same with pens that I do with brush pen points. It's embarrassing, frankly.
Yeah. And what I found is that traditionally there can be a difference. In a way, you take a 108 and you ink on a smooth sheet of paper or a rough sheet of paper. But Bob's Big Burger on a sheet of glass is the same as any other pen, so you don't actually get the physical difference that allows you to, it's like driving stick, it's like you're everything is sort of the same. So I found that there's only a handful of other pens that would give me a chunky, greasy, crumbly, chunky line, but you've got to be drawing that line big enough to even notice it, Because digitally you'll think, oh, this is really chunky, and then you zoom out and you're like, oh shit.
Yeah.
I can't even tell, right?
Yeah, and I always do all my stuff at 1200 DPI, so nothing ever shows up anyway. All my studio mates are like, "What are you doing? You're doing everything in 1200 DPI."
Well,
who was laughing when we made a 13-inch tall hardcover?
I was going to ask if Xander, do you know my friend Scratch Disc is full?
You know, I used to know that person very well, but now it's like computers are crazy. They don't have their scratch discs don't get full.
He used to visit me every month.
Oh yeah, not to mention his friend. Your computer just crashed and you lost 2 hours of work. I don't know. It's a long game.
We have one question left, and then we're gonna get you out of here, Xander. We had a great time talking to you.
Absolutely,
we're the
feelings
time
mutual.
I know, right? Eternity Forever asks, Xander, do you color guide and then hand the guide off to your colorist, or do you let them make those choices?
Yeah, no, I didn't have the time to do a color guide. I mean, if I had a character that was very specifically colored a certain way, I might mark on there. But really, if Jason just colored things, however, I could just recolor, and then and then if he saw the final thing, he'd say, "Oh, you know what? I see what you did. I see you made that change. I'm going to make that change going forward." And then it was it was easy. And I mean, I frankly, but I took his eye for color for granted. I mean, I tried not to, but like I did because one issue he couldn't do, and so we had somebody else doing it, and I was like, this person doesn't know what color all my funny monsters are, and so I'm having to recolor everything, and of course I missed some, and so I'm like looking at the final book, and I'm like, I blew it, but yeah, like, no, I really trusted Jason with the colors, and I hope he didn't feel like I was dumping too much work on him, but he was. I mean, his instincts were so good, so.
Well, that's fantastic. And I'm sure there's also kind of like there's a partnership, right? There's a little bit of harmony. And I don't know if you get into a rhythm of like looking at dailies, during the week. It's like, well, let me look through this last chunk here.
Well, and it was nice. I was always sort of uploading, the current, PDF of how the issue looked. And so like there might be some completely colored pages and some that were still penciled. And and I always felt like that was kind of fun to see where I was at. I was always stressed, I was trying to get things done, but like it was kind of fun to see where things were at. And it was nice to be able to have it up there so easily for the editor to know, like, oh, okay, this is gonna come in middle of next week instead of like who knows when.
Right. That's fantastic. Yeah. Xander, have we missed anything? Anything else you want to talk about or plug? Or Steve, you got anything?
Well, you hinted that you're working on the next thing. Is there anything you can share? Genre, age group?
Well, I have a couple things. I have a couple things I'm working on that are all kind of on the back burner, front burner, or whatever. I mean, I have a horror project, hopefully at Vault. I've got a science fiction project at Vault, and then hopefully going to do some writing for a mainstream series, and then I also have a project that I'm like 80 pages into, like a superhero, like not all ages, but middle grade or young adult graphic novel. All of this stuff is kind of like halfway done. Just waiting for one person to say, this is the next thing you're going to be working on. I'm like, okay, great. Yeah, I'll do that. I'm also drawing a Rick and Morty comic, so we'll
very cool. Very cool. I was going to say, like, if we have to have the chat sign an NDA, we can make a Google form real quick.
Right. That's probably really easy to do.
Yeah, we'll just get everybody's electronic signatures. Well, Xander, I've been putting on the screen all session your Tumblr, but do you have any other places you like people to check your work out at?
It's like we're all in this transition phase. Like I'm always telling people to go to my Twitter, but I mean, go if you want, but I post to it sometimes. But yeah, like I'm on Threads, I guess, and I'm also on Instagram at ZANDER CANNON. They're all kind of the same, except Twitter is at ZANDER_CANNON. Yeah, my Instagram is usually pretty, just my sketches and stuff like that. So
are you getting a Blue Sky? Are you getting on that too?
Well, I mean, who you know, who's got one of those? You know, please, anybody, send me a thing. No, I mean, our studio mates will have like they have them every once in a while, and so they say, "Who wants one?" And I'm like, you know, I'm like, and I'm too slow. Like,
yeah, somebody snatched it up.
That's
funny. Yeah, there's way too many things. All right, well, you know, we've had a fantastic time. It's kind of creepy that I'm watching the sunset behind you. As
all right, yeah, I know.
It's
like I am kind of in the dark now, so I'm trying to get in the light here.
A time lapse, but you know, when things start coming in the light for your other projects, we'd love to have you back on.
I'd love it too. That'd be really great.
Thank you. We have one guest, Ray Anthony Height, who's close to getting his master's green jacket of coming back onto the live cast. We'll have to add you to that too. So we'll talk, you know, maybe a little later this year or next year, and maybe we'll have you back on.
I love it.
So, guys, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you, Mike or Steve. Anything else for Xander before we wrap it up?
No, I'll have to go follow you on Instagram.
Yeah, there you go. Everybody, go follow Xander.
Yeah, right. There we go. We all do it.
All right. So, guys, well, thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. We got a outro. Guys, thanks so much for joining us live. If this has been your first time watching, please like, subscribe, and kick that alert button, that alarm button, so you get updates. We do this every week. We have a rich, robust archive of old episodes, and this is evergreen. So, Xander, you know, tell your constituents about this later on. They can go and watch it later.
I will. That'd be great.
Cool. All right. So we do a little thing. Hopefully you'll do it with us on our way out. Guys, I think the pandemic's over. I'm still not sure. I just heard something on the radio that said there's something else coming. So, you know, hide your wives and children. But I would be remiss if we didn't get out of here without washing our Kirby hands. So this is a thing we do. So let's see some Kirby hands, Xander. Give me some good. Yeah, there you go. That's with the curl. I like that. I like that. Guys, we'll see you next week. Xander, thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you soon.